Look at these headers I just picked up. So I was on Facebook Marketplace and I see these things, just headers for a Dodge, 125 bucks, right? So I went and grabbed them. Look at it, brand new, out of the package. I didn't get the actual package, but brand new, out of the package, chrome headers for a small block Mopar in a A or B body. So I mean, I saw the picture and I was like, oh, I could use those. So I went and I grabbed them. Guys, this is how you build stuff on a budget. See, most people are like, all right, well, I'm going to build this car now, this engine or whatever, and I'm just going to throw all the money at it. No, the way you do it is you take your time, okay? Figure out what you want, figure out what you want the overall package to be, the end result to be, and then just start accumulating parts. Keep your eyes open. That's an engine that I'm building for next year that I want to experiment with. So I picked up an intake manifold, beautiful Torker intake manifold for it, paid $100 for it. Usually they go for $250 used, but like almost brand new, $100. Those headers, it's a $750 set of headers. I picked them up for $125, Facebook Marketplace. Take your time, don't be in a rush. Just keep accumulating parts, know where you want to go with it, and then just keep accumulating parts, until you've got a big enough pile, and then put it all together. And you will not believe, you can build engines, you can build cars for 25 cents on a dollar if you're just patient and keep your eyes open. But that's not what we're talking about here. I just wanted to show off my newest acquisition there. That's not what we're talking about here. We want to talk about Oldsmobiles. So, all right, the last couple of videos we did had to do with Chevrolet's complete domination of the aftermarket industry and that exists to today. It transferred from the small block to the big block to the LSs and the Chevy-centric nature of it all. And we were talking about design flaws, shortcomings in certain cars or certain combinations, certain manufacturers that kept them from climbing to the top during this evolutionary period, which was the 1960s, the middle to late 1960s. So we talked about the Chrysler oil pans and oiling systems in general, the K-frame fitment problems. And we talked about Pontiac and how, Pontiac connecting rods. And a lot of you guys were asking, what about Oldsmobile? How about Oldsmobile? And this wasn't supposed to be a series, but it's popular. We're getting a lot of feedback and a lot of views on these videos. So I'm going to keep going with it for now. I don't want to go turn this into a whole thing. But I'm going to keep going on it. And based on the comments, people asking, what about Oldsmobile? Oldsmobile actually has a pretty significant role in all of this. And it is one of those brands that really should have been able to at least equal or had parity with the Chevrolet to a certain point. And to that point would be about 1963. And for a while, the Oldsmobile, through the later 50s and the very early 60s, the Oldsmobile engine was the choice for engine swapping. The Buick also, the nailhead Buick, but the Oldsmobile, very popular, those first generation Oldsmobile engines. And going into the muscle car era, from the 1950s into the very early 1960s, Oldsmobile really did have an edge. A lot of people don't realize Oldsmobile, the original Oldsmobile V8, 1949 was the very first regular production overhead valve V8. A lot of people chalk it up to the Cadillac, but the Oldsmobile was out before the Cadillac. And that original incarnation of the Oldsmobile motor was stout. It was recognized through the industry as an excellent performance package. And then you had the tri-power, like the J2 cars, 1957. Oldsmobile never got into the factory superstock wars like Ford, Pontiac, Chrysler did. They stayed away from all of that and just focused on just general good high-performance cars or packages. But then a funny thing happened on the way to the later 60s. A couple of funny things happened. And one of them doesn't really have anything at all to do with the mechanical aspects of the car, but more the social aspects of the car. And one of the reasons why Oldsmobile always lagged the other divisions and other manufacturers during that period of the muscle car era, the true muscle car era, 1964 to 1970, 71. And it has nothing to do with the cars, because the cars themselves were muscle car offerings. The Oldsmobile's muscle car offerings were on target. They were beautiful cars. You know, I have a friend of mine, Andy Hansen. That's the guy with the Hemi GTX. He also has a 66 Olds W30 show car. And every year I meet him at the Oldsmobile Nationals. And I marvel at these cars. They're beautiful. Every aspect, everything you could ever want out of an American muscle car, Oldsmobile, in that period of time, that later 60s, very early 70s, that was it. I mean, you're talking top of the line stuff. They skated around the General Motors 400 cubic inch limit with the Hurst Olds, so they got the 455 in the intermediate before anybody else did, 1968. They had all of the colors, all of the trims, all of the names. They had aluminum center sections and ram air induction, and they had all, and the colors and the trim, and just Oldsmobile muscle car performance and image from that period was top shelf, with one fatal flaw. And you have to go back to that exact specific period of time to really get it. All right, so now linguistics are important, and I'm going to give you an example of this. Right, linguistics are important. Words have meanings, subconscious meanings. Your subconscious mind doesn't process stuff, it reacts. It takes an image and a quick association, and then it leaves your conscious mind to figure out, you know, to do the reasoning on it. But your subconscious mind just reacts. So here's an example. If you went into a bank, let's just say you want to buy a house, and you go into a bank, and you go to the loan officer, and you say, hey, I want to buy this house. Can you lend me the money for the house? And if the loan officer said to you, well, yeah, we could do that, but there's going to be certain conditions to this loan, right? First is that if you default on a loan, you're going to lose everything, 100% of it. If you put money down on this house and you default on a loan, the money that we lend you, you're going to lose that. It's done. And you know, you're going to look at the loan officer and say, well, that's pretty harsh. You know what I mean? Like, you know. And then the loan officer said, you know what? Also, one other thing, you're really not worthy of a loan, okay? You're not like of nobility. I don't really see that in you. And so, you know what? You're going to pay me back on this loan until you're dead. You're going to pay me for the rest of your life. You know, 30 years, you'll probably live another 30 years, you'll pay me until you die. You would run the hell out of the bank, right? Because who would agree to terms like that? That's crazy, right? It's a death pledge. You're pledging to make this loan, to pay this loan in perpetuity until you're dead. Death pledge. But we call it a mortgage, which literally translates in French to death pledge, which means that you're not worthy of a loan, so you'll just pay me, I'll lend you this money, but you're going to pay me back until you die. And if you screw up just a little bit, you lose everything. Goodbye, right? So the linguistics are important. We call it a mortgage. You know, it's not, we don't call it a death pledge. Everybody wants a mortgage. Nobody wants a death pledge. All right, so you get where I'm going with this? You probably don't. 1960s. Youth market is everything. And that's where the GTO hit it right out of the park, because the GTO was ground zero of the youth market. It was and the Mustang also to an extent, but the GTO was ground zero targeted at the youth market. It was loud, it was bold, it was flashy, it had all of those elements. Now, Oldsmobile at the same time released the 442. Now, other manufacturers, you got names like Le Mans, Tempest, and right, okay, Catalina, Bonneville, right, and Oldsmobile, you got Cutlass, and then you got the Holiday Coupe, right? You know, so it's like you got a choice, and you got the GTO with the Holiday or a 442, and nobody really even knows what the 442 is. Is it 400 cubic inches, 4-speed dual exhaust, or is it 4-barrel carburetor, 4-speed dual exhaust? What does it even mean? Okay, it's just 442. And it's an option on the Holiday Coupe, and people are just like, Yeah, no, that just doesn't do it. That just doesn't do it. And then you go a little bit further on, and youth market goes crazy, and the whole everything in society is based on the youth market. It's the hippies and the psychedelic culture, and youth is everything. It's prominent. But the name Oldsmobile gets into the subconscious mind. Oldsmobile. And it makes all of these associations. Old is not good. Old is not vibrant and flashy and youthful and exuberant. It's old. And mobile, you think it brings you back to the horseless carriage days. It's the Hupmobile. It's like it brings to mind like Stanley steamers, not progressive, loud, fast, flashy image youth cars. So Oldsmobile going into the muscle car era had this terrible linguistics handicap that really kept it from gaining the widespread acceptance and the widespread the powerful presence in the muscle car market that it would have had with a different name. So that was a big factor. But mechanically, you had issues too. So when you talk about things like the small block Chevy, or just the Chevy line in general, and to a lesser extent the Chrysler line, interchange is very important, right? The fact that so many parts interchange throughout the years and the decades with the Chevrolet, and to a lesser extent with the Chryslers. Oldsmobile, you don't have that. Oldsmobile had a break. They had many different engine configurations. And on the surface, they're very confusing. You really need a book to follow along because there's early this and late that and big this and small that and blah, blah, blah. So the original Oldsmobile engines, the ones that really the performance legend was built on, beginning in 1949, was one class of engine. But now you get into the muscle car era, and you get into the 330s, ones that were introduced in 1964, and those are the ones that later evolved to the 455s and all of these stages in between. And it was one basic engine architecture, but with many variations to it, and a lot of things that don't interchange. Like, for instance, early camshafts in that series don't interchange with later camshafts. There's so many different variations in cylinder heads. There's so many different variations in the blocks themselves. And then you get to a couple of the fatal flaws of the Oldsmobile engine, aside from the confusion and the lack of interchangeability between them. So when I was a kid, I got thrown out of high school at 16, and I went right to work as a mechanic. I mean, I was a mechanic already. I'd been fixing my neighbors' cars and running a shop out of the school's auto shop. I was already well involved. When I got thrown out of school, I went to work for a gas station out in Tottenville on Staten Island. And one of the things that they always had a steady stream of Oldsmobiles needing head gaskets. So these were relatively late model cars at the time, so from the late 1960s and in through the early 1970s. And head gaskets were a thing. And I became the head gasket guy because, it was like, here's one job, keep doing it over and over and over again, and you'll do it really fast and you'll do it good. So Oldsmobiles, we had one come in a week or sometimes more than that needed head gaskets. It was just a common thing. So I became the Oldsmobile head gasket guy. And I got to the point that I could do an Oldsmobile head gasket and not even taking the intake manifold off, just get the exhaust manifold off of it, sneak the head out from between the intake and the exhaust, swap out the gasket, put the head back, and you're all good to go. But what I noted there, even as a kid, was that the Oldsmobile, aside different from the other engines of the day, had extremely large water passages in the deck. In my mind, it's almost like an open deck. The amount of surface area, actual clamping area between the head and the block, is less than other engines because the water passages are so big. They have these like triangulated water passages that run between the cylinders and in the deck. And that was a failure point. Now, Oldsmobile also had a second issue right there, and that's deck clamping. Because other engines, like, for instance, the Chevy, the small block, the big block, and the big block Chrysler, all had 5 bolts per cylinder. So they're arranged in a pentagonal shape, and you've got 1 bolt at the bottom of each cylinder to the outside, and then the others are spaced in such a way that you get even clamping all the way around. The Oldsmobile, in addition to having those huge water passages in the deck, only has 4 bolts around each cylinder. So that was a problem. So that's at the top end of the engine. And when you start pushing these things for compression, it becomes an issue. We'll talk about interchangeability and talk about head bolts for a second, because that, you see, a lot of confusion with the Oldsmobiles, because they had the original series of Olds motors, and then for a couple of years they used a version of the Buick 215, the aluminum motor. And this is what they did in the Oldsmobile Jetfire. And you talk about Oldsmobile performance first. The Jetfire was the very first production turbocharged V8 car. You had the Corvair was there. The Corvair was turbocharged at the same time as the Jetfire, but the Jetfire was the first turbocharged V8. Milestones, performance milestones up the wazoo. But when it really came to count, in the later part of the 60s, that's when it kind of all fell apart for Oldsmobile. So as I was talking about interchangeability, Oldsmobile used a derivative turbo cars of the Buick 215, which later became the Rover V8, the old aluminum one, and Oldsmobile actually added a set of cylinder head bolts to that engine for the turbocharged application. And they didn't have that row of cylinder head bolts on their later regular production V8s, which is, I don't know why they did that. It makes no sense. It's like kind of the travesty of Oldsmobile. All right, so you have you have a couple of limitations. Parts interchangeability between, these engines look so much alike, but they're so radically different that the interchange parts within that later Oldsmobile V8 family, and all the way up to the 403 that they put in the Trans Ams up until 1979 or 80, is one thing. Now, oiling is another severe issue with the Oldsmobiles. So the early Oldsmobile V8, okay, the early late engines, meaning the ones that were introduced in 1964, have, I would call, a normal main bearing journal diameter, so 2.5-inch bearing journal diameter. The later engines, when you get into, like I said, the guts of the muscle car era, these things had 3-inch main bearing journal diameters, and also a narrow main bearing. Now this is a problem. It's a problem for a couple of reasons. First is perception. And again, Chevy leading the way. The early small block Chevys, especially the small journal small block Chevys, the 283s and the 327s, were known for high RPM use. You could spin these things to 6,500, 7,000 RPM, and they would live. And you have that reputation further enhanced by, at the time, the Z28, the 302. You know, the motor didn't even start to make power until like 5,800 RPM. So in the minds of the muscle car enthusiasts of the day, RPM meant power, and they didn't really focus on torque. And the Oldsmobile was a torque motor. Now, this desire to spin engines really became a problem especially with the Oldsmobile, because of those very large, very narrow main bearings. The bigger the diameter of the main, the more leakage area there is around the outside of it. And that's how engines are designed. Engines are designed so that oil will leak past the bearings, and that oil flow past the bearings is what keeps the assembly cool. That's part of it. The larger the diameter, the more surface area on the sides there is for the oil to leak out, as it's supposed to, but it also limits the amount of oil per volume that's available to keep the rods lubricated. So what happens is, because you've got such a big diameter, this big diameter bearing, a narrow bearing, and a big diameter bearing, so much of it is bleeding out in the name of keeping that assembly cool, that not quite enough of it gets to the rods to keep them happy at higher RPMs. Smaller main bearing diameters mean happier high RPM use. So that was one of the major problems with Oldsmobiles. When you step on an Oldsmobile and you try to get real RPM out of it, it'll starve the bottom end for oil. Big, big problem with Oldsmobiles. Compounding that is a drain back issue. Oldsmobile motors don't drain back quite as well as some of the others. And so sustained high RPM use with, like, let's say, a 6-quart pan, and sustained high RPM use, meaning like a full quarter-mile pass at over 6,000 RPM, and by the time you're in the lights, all of the oil is up in the valve covers and not making its way down to where it needs to be. So an Oldsmobile motor is more likely to spin a bearing in the shutdown area than it is during the actual run itself. In addition to that, one of the things I remember very distinctly from the Oldsmobile motors I worked on as a kid was they were very sludge-prone engines. Now, all engines had some sludge back in the day because of the non-detergent oils that were used. But the Oldsmobile, as I remember them, were very susceptible to this sludging up, which further inhibits the oil drain back down to the pan, where it's needed. They had a lot of things going against them. Now, taken in their own right, a 455, 442, or Hurst Olds, or tuned and set correctly and operated in the range that engine wants to be operated in, they're brutes. I mean, they're incredibly smooth. Like it's just a silky outflowing of torque. They're magic. The way they're designed, they're an excellent, excellent engine. But once you get into that deal where you're really pushing it, and it's got to spin RPM, and it's just no. There's just too many design flaws. Not so much design flaws, but anti-racing sort of things that inhibit it from racing, and the interchange. Like I said, early cams don't interchange with late cams because they change the lifter angle. And I'm not an Oldsmobile guy, so I don't remember all of the little details, and I'm sure some of you guys will jump in there and do that. But that was the issue with Oldsmobile. Now, as an aside, and this is something that always puzzled me, and again, I chalk it up to the travesty of the Oldsmobile. Back in the middle to late 1980s, Oldsmobile, for whatever reason, decided to spend a ton of money on drag racing. It started with Warren Johnson. Warren Johnson was a hitter in pro stock. Warren Johnson was running Oldsmobile motors. They were running engines based off the diesel block, which was a heavier duty engine. But it had a lot of shortcomings. It had all of these shortcomings that we're talking about. And legend has it that Warren Johnson took one of these blocks and literally hollowed it out. So it was just the outside of the block. Literally hollowed the block out, and then using welding rod, just welding metal into this block, built a big block Chevy inside of this Oldsmobile architecture. And that was his pro stock engine, and he cleaned house with this thing for a couple of years. So that popularity, I guess, drew Oldsmobile into really throwing their weight, their advertising budget, whatever, it's really throwing their weight at drag racing, which was incredibly puzzling to me because they focused a lot on Top Fuel and Funny Car. Like a perfect example was like they sponsored Dick LaHaye. And clearly, this is a Top Fuel dragster, and clearly it's got a Chrysler Hemi derivative, Chrysler Hemi or Chrysler Hemi derivative, however you want to phrase it. In the engine, you can't miss it, but it's got Oldsmobile written on. It just was everywhere. They were sponsoring the name on all kinds of dragsters, all kinds of funny cars. Oldsmobile. But they weren't marketing anything performance-wise that for the street. Remember, this is like the late 1980s. They had the Cutlass 442, but it really didn't sell big numbers. Excellent cars, but didn't sell big numbers. The Monte SS, they sold, I don't know, probably 10 Monte SSs for every one Olds 442. But Oldsmobile threw money like crazy. I worked for a guy named Jerry Caminito at the time, the Blue Thunder funny car, and he had an Oldsmobile sponsorship. We had an Olds Cutlass body on the car. Not really the best looking car. Jerry's cars were beautiful, but the Cutlass funny car body was not my favorite. It just, But yeah, for some reason, they went nuts in drag racing in that period of time, spent all kinds of money for really no good results. I will never understand what they were after during that period of time. All right, so that's my quick overview of Oldsmobile. I know I've left stuff out. There's a lot to it, but I mean, this video is already probably almost like 25 minutes long, and I don't want to go too much further. This isn't really a series. I didn't intend it to be a series. It was just an observation that I wanted to make originally, the Chrysler versus the Chevy. And like I said, you guys are asking about Oldsmobile, so I threw my 2 cents in for Oldsmobile. I've done stuff on Buicks in the past. Maybe we'll do something with Buicks give me a week or two. I want to give this a rest and do some other stuff, and we'll talk about Buicks and Fords. A lot of you guys keep asking about Fords. You know what? I'll tell you what. The whole Ford thing is so complicated and so layered and so convoluted. I really need to sit down and figure out where to even start with that. But and I'm not dissing Fords. Hey, listen, you Ford guys know what you got. I know it's no news from me telling you that you got some crazy stuff going on there. But like I said, this wasn't intended to be a series, but you guys seem to be enjoying this type of video, so we'll do some more. But that's it. That's my take on Oldsmobiles, and I hope you got something out of that, and I'll see you tomorrow.